Yeah, that's a good point. So I just showed you two ways, the very low calorie diets, for example, and the bariatric surgery. Because we always tend to say that it's just good to lose weight no matter what you are eating, so just to reduce your caloric intake. But in this study, the belly fat study, they wanted to find out if it actually matters what people eat on a weight loss diet. So if it's good to, well, just get rid of all your sugars, for example, so do not eat any sugar sweetened beverages or no crisps, no fries, etc. Or that you can just, well, lower your caloric intake but still eat an unhealthy diet. And they measured a lot of things, well, to make any conclusions. So, for example, they measured the weight loss, but also cholesterol levels, insulin sensitivity, the amount of fats in the liver, for example. So it was a very, well, elaborate study, I would say. And the interesting thing is that they had two groups in which they advised people to reduce their caloric intake, and in one group they advised people to do this with a low quality diet. So here people were eating, for example, fruit juices or candies, but they were on a caloric restriction. And they compared this with a high quality diet, which was also a caloric restriction, but then with, for example, whole wheat bread or a lot of vegetables and fruits. And what they saw that after 12 weeks, the group that consumed a healthy or a high quality diet lost more weight compared to the people that were on a low quality diet. This is quite interesting because they also asked, of course, what people consumed. So they asked people to complete dietary recalls. And based on these recalls, the reported energy intake in both diets was the same, but still the group on the high quality diet lost more weight compared to the low quality diet. So this gives some indication as that it is important that you should not only just reduce people's caloric intake, but that you should also pay attention to what people are eating on a caloric restriction. So, and this comes to, I think, the recommendations that we also wrote down in the dietary guidelines, which is not only focusing on lowering body weight, which is one of the factors, but also on what kind of dietary pattern people should eat and what patterns could be considered as being healthy. So we concluded actually in the end of the guideline that there are 4 dietary patterns that can be considered an option for people with type 2 diabetes. And I'm just checking the time, but maybe this is also a good time for a break before we go further into the dietary patterns. So shall we have a break of about 10 minutes? Just come back at 55? Yeah? I'm not sure if everyone is back already, but I think we can just start and continue. Yes, thank you. So we ended before the break with the different dietary patterns for the management of type 2 diabetes. And what you see is that there is a difference in what these descriptions of diets focus on. So the first two, the low carbohydrate diets and the low fat diet, really focus on the macronutrient intake. And this is actually a big debate in the field of type 2 diabetes. Like if people should adhere to a low fat diet or to a low carb diet, and what would be most healthy for people with type 2 diabetes. And you may have seen this evidence pyramid before. So in terms of dietary guidelines, also this pyramid is very relevant because we always want the best evidence to recommend anything about diets in general or dietary patterns. So if we want to know if people should adhere to a low carb diet or to a low fat diet, we really want to have randomized controlled trials that compare these two diets. And if you set up such a randomized controlled trial, you of course have a sample population. So in this case, it would be the people with type 2 diabetes. And then you measure different outcomes, such as the HbA1c or the fasting glucose, or for example one of the insulin sensitivity indexes we discussed yesterday. So this is, I think, well, not the most difficult in setting up such an intervention. But if we look in the terms of what people, are going to, what you're really going to intervene, so what kind of diet you would recommend people to adhere to, there are a lot of things to consider. So you can say, well, this group of people, you should consume a low-carb diet and you should consume a low-fat diet, but that doesn't really give people any instructions on what they should eat. And also in literature, there's not really a consensus about what is a low-fat diet or what is a low-carb diet. So in this table you see, it's actually a funny study that compared different low-carb and low-fat diets in different papers. And they find out that there are, well, a number of, many different ways of defining low-carb and low-fat diets. So for example, in some low-carbohydrate diets, in studies, they advise people to consume less than 40 grams of carbohydrates a day, whereas in others they refer to a percentage of carbohydrates in their diets, and sometimes they even go with stronger reductions, so 20 grams of carbohydrates, and sometimes they, say 5 to 10% of their daily intake. And to give you some indication, we know that in the Netherlands people consume about 47% of their total energy intake of carbohydrates. So if you recommend people to consume only 5 to 10% of their energy intake coming from carbohydrates, they really need to change their diets very strictly. And the same actually holds for, low-fat diets, because we know that people consume generally about 30% of their energy intake from fat. So if you, advise people to reduce this to below 30%, I think that's not the biggest change. But if you advise people to go below this 10%, people really need to change their diets in a big way. And this, I think, is a good thing to be aware of, that if you reduce your carbohydrate intake, that you automatically increase your fat intake. So if you are talking about low carbohydrate diets in terms of energy percentages, if people generally consume about 50% of their energy intake from carbohydrates, but you need them to reduce it to 20%, for example, but if they keep their energy intake the same, this means that there's a larger proportion of their diet coming from fats. And this means that most low carbohydrate diets are actually high fat diets. I see it's low fat here, but it should be a high fat diet. And the same holds for the low fat diets. If people reduce their fat intake, this means that their intake of carbohydrates in percentages goes up. So it's not only about, if you prescribe people to consume a low fat diet, they reduce, of course, their fat intake, but there's also something happening in all the other factors that play a role in their diets. And besides what people eat, I think it's also important to take a look at the duration of studies. You can advise people to only change their diet for just one day, but you can imagine that this does not have major effects on the HbA1c, because the HbA1c reflects the sugar levels over the past 2 to 3 months. So you really need studies that follow people for a longer period of time. And this can also explain different study results. So in this study they compared low-fat and low-carb diets. So they took low-fat diets for which people consumed less than 30 energy% from fat, and compared them with interventions in which they consumed less than 40% from carbohydrates. And then here you see the results for HbA1c in studies that followed people for 8 weeks. And this is actually the result of these studies. So this this square shows the combined results of the two studies that were included. You see that this favors the low-carb diet. So the HbA1c was lower for the people who adhere to a low-carb diet compared to the people who adhere to a low-fat diet. So based on this study, I would say, that means that people with diabetes should consume a low-carb diet, because that favors apparently their HbA1c. But if we compare this to the studies with a longer follow-up, we actually see that this effect disappears over time. So the first row shows the results for studies with a follow-up of about 26 weeks, so approximately half a year. You already see that the results For example, for this last study, the results are, well, not as convincing, I would say, because they're results that show that it favors a low-carb diet, but also favors a low-fat diet. And if you summarize all the effects, you still see there's the HbA1c is lower for the low-carb group, but the effects are not as big as for the results for the 8-week studies. And then if we look in the studies that follow people longer, so for 2 years, we see that there's actually no difference in HbA1c for the groups that follow the low-carb diet or a low-fat diet. So this would mean that, well, perhaps you would say, well, then only follow a low-carb diet for 8 weeks, but of course we want people to adhere to a diet that they can follow for a long period of time, actually for the rest of their life. And if I look into these results, I would say, well, apparently after 2 years, this HbA1c, there's no difference for people following a low-fat or a low-carb diet. So there's always an effect or a balance between the effect and adherence, because, well, in these studies they recommend people for 2 years to follow a low-fat or a low-carb diet. But it's always the question, of course, if people are able to adhere to these guidelines for a period of 2 years. I can imagine that when you put people on a diet for 8 weeks, that is way easier than to adhere to the guidelines for more than 2 years, for example. So not only in research, I think there's this balance between what we see and what we advise people to do, but also in general practice. If you advise people to adhere to a certain diet, it's always important to, well, not only give the advice, but also to see what this does with someone's person and someone's life. And then there's another thing to consider in terms of the low-carb diets. Here they refer to very low carbohydrate diets, so this means that there's a large reduction in the carbohydrate intake. This paper shows the effects on LDL cholesterol, and LDL cholesterol is an important risk factor for getting cardiovascular diseases. And what they showed here is that if you summarize all the different studies, so this is again a meta-analysis of different intervention studies, you see that in the end there is an increased LDL cholesterol for all the diets that, for all the low carbohydrate diets. And this is something we see more often in low carbohydrate studies, that apparently the LDL cholesterol increases, which is of course not a favorable outcome. So also here there's some balance between, well, we see it on the short term that the HbA1c improves, but on the other hand we see, or we know that there's something happening with this LDL cholesterol, which means that we are a bit cautious in recommending people to follow a very low carbohydrate diet. And that is also the reason that we if you look into the recommendations for both